This is a Niche Radio podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or log into www.nicheradio.co.za.
Welcome to SuperDads. The professor, the doctor is in. Professor David Carpenter of the School of Public Health at the University of Albany is very kind and generous to donate his time to us today. And he is one of those special guests, and I'm going to give you a bit of background to him and why we're actually very fortunate to have him on the show today. So his expertise is human health effects of environmental contaminants, including metals and organic compounds. He is a public health physician who serves as director of the Institute for Health and the Environment, a collaborating center of the World Health Organization, as well as a professor of environmental health sciences at Albany School of Public Health. He did previously serve as director of the Wadsworth Center of the New York State Department of Health and as dean of the University at Albany School of Public Health. Professor Carpenter, who received his medical degree from Harvard Medical School, has more than 435 peer-reviewed publications, 6 books, and 50 reviews and book chapters to his credit. And a lot of the peer-reviewed publications will be in the show notes linked to researchgate.net, which you will have access to. And what makes him quite unique is that he has appeared in a number of documentaries. So, you know, if you see his picture on the YouTube recording we're going to have here from the show, you should recognize him quite well. And you'll be able to also get links to the different programs he's been on. And he is quite unique is that he's very communicable. He puts things quite easy and interesting and understanding. And he is definitely a super dad for the show because not only is he a father and grandfather, but he is a father to all of his students as well over the many, many years. Professor David Carpenter, thank you so much for being with us on the show.
It's my great pleasure to be here.
So, I'm going to ask some questions that, I know you've been answering these questions for years and years on the different appearances. So I'm going to do my best to try to keep this interview show a bit more interesting. And also, there's always new things all the time. And hopefully we can have things a bit more interesting for you than the usual repetition you've been doing over the years.
Great.
So we'll cover the first personal basics is one always questions, these effects from non-native EMFs and the environment. Typically, there would be a personal story involved in it, where it would affect one personally, either through the work that's been done or how it affects them personally. And tell us, sort of what became your personal interest and passion drive in you that you just couldn't stop or avoid this type of field of study.
Well, I've sort of followed my nose over my whole career because I went to medical school, but I'd had a wonderful experience as an undergraduate doing research. And when I got to medical school, I sort of found that I was expected to memorize a lot of things and not think about much. So I didn't finish medical school, but I took some time off doing research and became very interested in the brain and how the brain works. And that's been one of the themes of my career ever since then. But I first, for about 20 years, did primarily just basic neurobiology. But then I got this position as the director of the State Health Department laboratories in New York. And suddenly I had all these challenges of trying to understand what public health is, focusing much more on preventing disease rather than treating it, but trying to find out what the origin of various kinds of diseases was. And that still is my major activity. Now, most of my personal research has been focused on individual chemicals and how those affect human health. And I've done a lot of work more recently with polychlorinated biphenyls, chlorinated pesticides, that sort of thing. But early on, I've gotten sort of dragged into the issue of electromagnetic fields and what they do, even though this has never been my personal research. When I came to New York in 1980 as the director of the State Health Department laboratories, there had been a settlement 2 weeks before I arrived on the question of whether there were health hazards of living near high voltage power lines. And as the new guy in the block and someone that had come from a radiation research institute, I was given the responsibility for administering that program, which concluded about 7 years later with pretty strong evidence that there was an elevated risk of leukemia in children if they lived in a house that had high magnetic fields from power lines. And I have never escaped that issue since then, and I'm very much involved now in discussions of mobile phone hazards, mobile phone base stations, Wi-Fi, smart meters, 5G, all of these other issues that involve exposure to electromagnetic fields.
And I think there's a few key things that you picked up that you mentioned I'd like to focus in on. Is one, we'll go backwards to the front. Is, when you did this, the first power line study, again, typically in the West, any study that sort of was able to demonstrate proof, got hit from different sides. There was support and there's also opposition from industry. And as there's been different complaints of both sides, positive and negative, from academics and researchers, is that particularly with the power lines, and we have, back to Robert Becker, David Becker, no, Robert Becker, yeah.
Robert Becker.
Yes. And how, when demonstrating these effects, funding would be retracted. And, sometimes scientists had trouble with it, or they had their jobs threatened. And it's quite a difficult thing to stay in this kind of field. And, I wanted to sort of know your experience, how, if you receive these kind of issues, and what kind of tasks did you take to make sure that you stayed in the field and a researcher of value and carried on contributing?
Well, again, I was perhaps fortunate in that it was never my own research. I was never searching for funding to do these studies. And, I have my own searches for funding for other kinds of studies. So in that way, I was a little more free of the pressures from industry. But it's interesting because just recently, I'm in the process of reviewing the results of published studies around power lines and magnetic fields, so separate from the radio frequency fields, in terms of whether or not there was industry funding in relation to whether the results demonstrated harm or did not demonstrate harm. And perhaps it's not any surprise at all that those studies funded by industry, about 80% of them do not report any adverse health effect. Those studies funded independently from government funds, from universities, from foundations, almost all of them report elevations in various illnesses, primarily cancer. So it is a real problem. And I think that the lesson people have to learn is when you look at a published article or a newspaper report, ask the question, who funded that study? Because conflicts of interest, even if they have less obvious impact, they really do change the nature of the results that are reported. And we really need to have independent funding for issues that are so important to society, as the issue is of cancer from exposure to electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, I mean, even in my thesis, there was always this easy gravitation for persons or the public wanting, and even my supervisors, wanting to gravitate to the issue around wireless and cell phones, and those are the big issue. But in my thesis, I found the pattern more that magnetic fields is more of an issue and a concern and has a strong impact. And also that we find, when we even have the wireless signal, that we have a magnetic field within them, because we have the field intensity and the magnetic field. And, I was fortunate to gravitate early in the year towards Professor Paul Hero's work, which I understand you've been involved, fortunately, in terms of being an external examiner for one of his students, Lech. And, you're one of those unique individuals that your research also is multidisciplinary, and you're able to understand nonlinear research. And that's probably what's great or unique about your interest and focus on the brain, and why when I view your pattern of the type of papers you've done and getting funding, is that you've been focusing on the primary unified theory the whole time, but just using different names for the same pattern and same exposure. And, when it comes down to, like, when Hero's work, it comes down to the mitochondria. And, with the brain being so dense in it, and it only being 2% of the mass of the body, it uses about 20% of oxygen. And we understand with non-native EMFs, unfortunately, the literature is very discriminatory because it's the visible spectrum. So it's like blue light. And then we have the extremely low field, we have the high frequency, but essentially they come down to a unified theory of how the function and performance of mitochondria is disrupted with electron train transport and other aspects in terms of non-native EMFs.
Well, I totally agree with that. I think the role that mitochondria play is absolutely central. And if we talk about the electromagnetic fields, I mean, mitochondria play a role in a lot of other diseases as well. But I don't think there's very much difference between the power line magnetic field effects and those of radio frequency fields. Increasingly, we see that reactive oxygen species are generated by electromagnetic fields of all wavelengths. That's true for ionizing radiation as well. Ionizing radiation is more likely to hit a water molecule than a DNA molecule and generate reactive oxygen species. We have overwhelming evidence for both magnetic fields and radio frequency fields that there is generation of reactive oxygen species. And mitochondria produce reactive oxygen species just as part of normal metabolism. And there are, of course, cellular mechanisms to try to minimize the damage resulting from these. But I think the evidence now is very, very clear that electromagnetic fields of different wavelengths increase the generation of reactive oxygen species and can do so by swamping the defense mechanisms that the cell has. And then that leads to a whole variety of things. Cancer is certainly one of them, but also this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity, which is increasingly a problem in every country in the world, primarily as a result of this enormous expansion in the exposure that we all get now from radio frequency everything, from Wi-Fi everywhere, from cell towers everywhere, from everyone's got a mobile phone. So that the density of exposure that we all have now is just much greater, and we're seeing much more frequent development of the syndrome of electrohypersensitivity. It's been known for a long time. We had this very interesting event in the US where the Russians irradiated the US embassy in Moscow back in the Cold War days. And everybody got very excited by that because they thought the Russians knew something we didn't about health effects of electromagnetic fields. And there were studies of cancer, but of course nobody found elevations in cancer because the latency between exposure and development of cancer is long. But there was a lot of headaches and inability to sleep, the various pains and aches. And this was passed off as simply being anxiety. But these are precisely the common symptoms that we see in people that become electrosensitive from excessive exposure to radiofrequency radiation. So I think this is a real syndrome. The characteristic ailments are relatively non-specific and difficult to prove, but that doesn't mean that it's not real, that it's, and I think the evidence is that it is caused by excessive exposure to radiofrequency radiation or magnetic field radiation as well.
Yes, like you said, there's definitely an effect, and it comes difficulty with which language is utilized. I mean, my thesis, one of the methodologies I used was a scientific technical analysis. It's used in finances, and it's also used in a climate change framework. And it breaks into three broad categories of sensitivity, adaptability, and vulnerability. And what I found was, in terms of sensitivity, technically everyone's electrosensitive. It's just everyone has different,
Our bodies are electric, especially our brain. It operates by electricity.
Yes, and we know that when one way of diagnosis by looking at the EEG and EKG, when there's a sort of a very docile alpha wave pattern that the person's, being affected by the non-native EMFs, where, if a person isn't really affected on a healthy level, is that it has quite a high flux density. It's quite erratic.
Right.
And, it gets tricky because I know you've mentioned in the past, there's Volkov's work with glucose metabolism in the brain, and how, and it's a response reaction because the mitochondria being affected is unable to properly process oxygen at the first stage in the mitochondrial process. Then it wants to sort of use more calories or glucose and insulin disruption to compensate for it. Because we understand that non-native EMFs has the capacity to break covalent bonds. So it's a sort of its effect where how the respiratory proteins are being stretched, and we're not having this shrinking effect, that electrons are being lost, and we're having this disruption. And then as a result, we're having this other issue of these feedback mechanisms. So, when the ATP starts to fail with the ATPase, then we're having the AMP case reacting or sticking in. And we have all these disruptions of chemical signals going left, right, and center. And the body's kind of going, what am I doing? And as you mentioned, with these non-native EMFs, they're going on 24/7 and creating these issues. And, from what I've found is that non-native EMFs are one of the way they're being propagated to now is one of the leading non-linear contributors to things like obesity, diabetes, and other Neolithic diseases. And that, if we stretch it, we understand that technically diabetes is a form of EHS. If a person implements mitigation options, it can be altered. But if it carries on to where the body no longer has an adaptive compensation mechanism, then we get to a stage of vulnerability, which would be, as Professor Dominic Balpoem did in his paper years ago, that becomes a state of electromagnetic field intolerance syndrome. So these different stages that would come into it, and persons sometimes get confused with the language or where it's utilized, and then relying on whatever media jargon's being thrown around.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I think that one of the points you're making, which I totally agree with, is that EHS is so closely related to so many other symptoms or so many other syndromes. Multiple chemical sensitivity, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, Gulf War illness. These are, and a whole host of others, have symptoms that are all these non-specific kinds of things: headaches, fatigue, inability to sleep, ringing in the ears. Now, when you get to things like diabetes, and a lot of my work has been on diabetes, that's perhaps a little further of a stretch, but it also does involve a whole host of not only behavioral, but metabolic and biochemical mechanisms. You mentioned the Volkov study, and I have a personal experience with that technique of looking at deoxyglucose, which is a little off the subject of what we're talking about, but it is interesting. I was at one point interested in how we perceive warmth, and the most sensitive warmth detectors in the whole animal kingdom are the pit vipers, the pit receptors of rattlesnakes and boas and that sort of thing. And we did a study where we were using the same technique that Volkov used to map the projections into the brain of these snakes from light as compared to heat. And we could look at the pattern. So if we gave a light stimulus, we got uptake of deoxyglucose in the outer layers of the optic tectum. If we gave a heat stimulus, we got labeling in inner layers of the optic tectum that received this heat information. So it's a very powerful technique. And when you can demonstrate changes in the metabolism of a particular area of a brain, you know that there's a stimulation of electrical activity. And it seems to me that study of Volkov is so important because there could be no better demonstration of how, in this case, a mobile phone that was muted but held to the head generates changes in brain metabolism. So very, very important.
Yeah, and on that study as well, I found subsequent work as well showed that blue light has able to trigger the same effect, not only in the eyes, but also in the skin. And, you know, both a combination, I'm just labeling them, grouping them together, the non-native EMFs.
That's appropriate.
Yeah. When they group together and how they affect the brain is that one, it's lowering dopamine levels. But again, this thing of, you know, you said it's a bit of a stretch, but with the thing of obesity and diabetes, particularly in the brain, you know, we're having these glucose levels changing, these insulin levels. And, you know, tying in with neurology is that what I found with medicine is that it tends to focus a lot on biochemistry and not attaching the side of physics. So, you know, the Russian studies or Eastern stuff, it combines the two together, where in Western medicine tends to be avoided. And the great thing with biophysics is that it helps use these fundamental principles of physics to explain biology in a much simpler way than trying to describe these different patterns. So, you know, with obesity or diabetes, or it's focused on obesity, is that sort of a disease of leaking light in the brain, where these electrons are being lost through the covalent bonds, being affected by these different disruptions. And then we have this excess of protons, which then, you know, creates this swelling effect in the body, this inflammatory effect. And then, you know, persons as a result will then try consume more carbs or those other elements to try get the electrons, but they're not getting enough of them. So when we're looking at mitigation options being provided, things like, you know, you have the options of grounding or having foods with high DHA and electron content, and even things like cold thermogenesis for uncoupled haplotypes. You know, it's sort of, it attach or addresses these issues of these lost electrons. And the persons who are having issues with obesity and or diabetes, is a very quick and radical improvement and change in the issue. But it does require quite an environmental change that, you know, is difficult, particularly when a brain is being affected into a state of these chemical changes from non-native EMFs into a low dopamine state. Because we understand that the ability to think laterally or connecting dots is inhibited. So a person is going to become more narrow-centered, and it's difficult even with other scientists who are working in these, you know, environments of high native non-native EMFs. It's difficult for them to connect the dots. I mean, you being a professor with experience in multidisciplinary research and nonlinear analysis, it would encounter these problems with other scientists who want to think of everything must be linear. And unfortunately, biology is non-linear.
It certainly is not linear. You know, I've gotten very much involved in environmental causes of diabetes. I haven't really thought so much about EMFs as a risk factor, but we've been studying in a Native American population the association between exposure to some chemicals and diabetes. And our more recent studies have focused, well, a lot of my work has been with polychlorinated biphenyls, and this is a mixture of chemicals, 209 different chemicals. It's a biphenyl ring with different numbers of chlorines around the ring. And what we find, it's been known for quite a while, there's an association between exposure and diabetes. But more recently, what we're finding, it's the exposure is limited to those PCBs that have fewer chlorines, and therefore they can be breathed in. So we think that inhalation is the major route of exposure, not eating contaminated food. And then we find also that the association between diabetes and obesity is really quite different than what most people believe. Most physicians say you get diabetes because you're too fat, you don't exercise, and you eat the wrong foods. With this association with diabetes resulting from exposure to a chemical, and one might even think about EMFs as well. But the major source of exposure to these chemicals is animal fats in food. And so you get exposed to the chemical from eating too much fat, but obesity is a result perhaps not just of eating too much fat, but because the eating the fat gives you exposure to more chemicals. So it's a very complicated thing. And now as people look at other environmental causes of diabetes and of obesity, we're finding many, many different factors that interplay there. So I think there's been a tendency to blame people. You know, you get diabetes because you're too fat, you don't exercise. Well, it may be a little more complicated than that. And it may be really that our development of these huge numbers of chemicals that are so much a part of every person's life today have a downside. They may make life a little easier, but they also may make life a little shorter.
Correct. And I mean, when we look at Professor Doug Wallace's work in mitochondrial medicine, the effects from the chemicals as you're describing and the non-native EMFs are both doing the same disruption where they're affecting the redox potential of the mitochondria. So the moment you have that effect, the redox occurring, then you're going to have these disruptions and, like you said, the onset of diabetes. And it's not
absolutely right.
And it's not a thing of a person being fat. It's a person of their redox potential being affected. And people tend to make this mistake where they want to focus on detoxing. Now, if your redox is not performing, the engine of your body is not performing, it's not able to assimilate oxygen properly, it's not able to work with the electrons properly, then yes, you're going to have this disruptive effect. And to go for a detox is only going to make things worse because you don't want to further lose things. You want to make sure the body is going to effectively use them. And like you mentioned the key thing with fats and the whole ketosis diet. I mean, we have a local doctor named Tim Noakes who's been, made this jump shift of, going to the no carb and go to the fats diet. And, because the way the environment and these aspects is affecting the mitochondria, going into ketosis, which is used as the second stage of the mitochondria, of the ATP process, is vital because, you're not able to work with oxygen. And you mentioned earlier, there's this effect with breathing it in. And then now we wanted to go into ketosis because the body can better absorb and handle the electrons, better availability of water through it. But again, comes the issue of if your environmental circumstances is affecting the redox, even if you're having those fats, the body's going, hey, hold on, my liver can't function here because it's being disruptive.
Right.
My natural solar cycle, circadian rhythm with the sun is being disruptive. So if you're not getting up in the morning, you're not having that AM sunlight to kickstart the melatonin production in the body, then the liver is not able to process these things. And that's why we call it a nonlinear effect, because a small disruption in one area creates these massive knock-on effects to the rest of the body.
And it's so clear that nonlinear effects are super critically important in just about everything. The old idea that the toxicologists had that everything had to be a linear dose-response relationship, it just does not apply. There's so many interactions. What we know now is that low concentrations of chemicals induce genes that don't get induced when there's higher concentrations. And so this interplay where different environmental factors all perturb the system, but they do it in different but interactive ways. So it is a much more complex system than what we used to think, where everything was focused on one particular action, one particular receptor, one particular pathway. It's not so simple as that.
And also there's the whole, the genotype cytochrome isoenzymes issue. I don't know if I assume you may be familiar with DeLuca's paper, where it looked at the missing glutathione S transphase variants in different population groups.
I'm not familiar with that paper, no.
So it was a methodology approach to look at genetic biomarkers test, and certain populations that had the missing GST enzymes, which are necessary for detoxic EMFs through glutathione conjunction. Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with that paper.
I'm not very familiar. I'm aware of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Right. So yeah. So the idea was that the different GST polymorphisms show a lead to diseases or protection of certain diseases. So what I found was, the one GSTT1, there was, of the population, 15% didn't have it, and of the GSTM1, 50% didn't have it. But again, this becomes an issue of, when you're designing medicine
Right.
drugs for persons, you would have one population in China that has the necessary isoenzymes and other parts that don't. So it becomes very difficult.
And this explains why some people develop symptoms from exposure and other people do not, because we don't all have exactly the same biochemistry. There's so many differences of polymorphisms of this sort of thing. So it's no wonder that some segment of the population shows electrohypersensitivity, others do not.
Yeah, it makes it tricky, but it is a nice way of diagnosing. But I mean, with you being a physician, I know you sometimes still see patients once in a while. So, how do you handle or your protocol when you have a patient coming in and you're having these complaints and issues? So how do you sort of address them as giving a basic advice to our physicians here in South Africa?
Well, I'm not licensed to practice medicine at this stage, so I don't see patients, but I have many opportunities to talk with individuals who call me or email me about specific things related to their disease. But at this point, I'm not a licensed physician. But I think that the answer is that nobody can, when you have an individual with a specific disease, it's almost impossible to identify with any great confidence the cause of that disease. Many people that smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day will develop lung cancer, but there are many people that develop lung cancer that don't smoke, that are not known to be inhaling radon and other carcinogens. It's just that our bodies are different, and we don't metabolize everything the same. There are genetic components of disease, and so we have to be careful in terms of explaining an individual's disease, and that's why it's so important to study the patterns of these diseases in the population, which is what I do at this stage in my life.
And it's very tricky. Like you said, the key word is that there's never really this definitive thing. But when it comes to persons wanting to implement policies or protection mechanisms or legislation, they wanting this expected, I want a definitive hard crack that this is a thing and prove that this person has this specific source.
Yes or no answer. That's what they want. Yes.
Yes. And you've had a lot of experience in merging science and legislation together, and you've done a number of testimonies. So tell us a bit about your experience with how one would merge science and legislation together. Well,
I think it's pretty clear to me that legislation is really important. Education is valuable, but education doesn't really change people's behavior. So if there's some evidence that something causes harm, let's take, for example, mobile phones held to your head. You can tell people till you're blue in the face, don't hold that phone to your head, or don't put that, if you're a woman, don't put that phone in while it's active in your bra. But that often doesn't really change things. So what I try to do is look at the weight of evidence to use that to mobilize regulatory agencies to establish regulations. Now, it's not an easy task to do. The question is, what level of proof is required before you can establish regulations? As you probably understand, I was a co-editor in chief of the Bioinitiative report, and we tried very hard to identify levels of exposure to both to ELF, to power line and magnetic fields, and to radio frequency fields, for which there was evidence for harm. But the evidence for harm was at intensities that were simply not realistic to establish as regulatory standards. On the other hand, the current regulatory standards in most countries are so ridiculously high relative to what we know causes harm that they're worthless. They become an excuse to do nothing, and they ignore the enormous body of evidence that shows harms at 1/10,000th of the exposure level. So there's no easy answer to your question. How does one use science to implement regulation? The problem becomes much greater when you have a population that's already addicted to the use of a technology like radio frequency radiation. So nobody wants to hear that it causes brain tumors, that it causes other cancers, that it causes electrohypersensitivity. And when people then develop those diseases, it's too late. But there's got to be a continued balance between what's realistic and what's important to impose as a regulatory standard. Behavioral change only goes so far. And at a population level, it usually doesn't go all that very far. At least in the US, the perfect example is smoking. Everybody knows smoking causes cancer, but the most effective way we've had to reduce smoking in this country and in most developed countries is, number one, restrict the sale of cigarettes, especially to minors, raise the price of the cigarettes so that most people can't afford them, prohibit smoking in most office buildings so that there's not that much, it's a real inconvenience to be addicted to cigarettes. There are issues like that where regulation is really important.
Yeah, I mean, you kicked on some key points there with the whole addiction element, or persons being addicted to it, and you know, bringing in Volkov's work of where we see how the brain's being affected and the low dopamine levels, and we've seen this also association with increase in opiate addiction. So persons are, you know, getting addicted to this effect, a multitude of effects that are non-linear effects that are happening. And you know, part of my thesis, I looked at looking at sort of which countries adopt a more biological response protection regulatory system versus the thermal effect. And you know, when I looked at the numbers from a population point of view, majority of the countries follow the biological protection mechanism. So like China, Russia,
Right.
India, and so forth. And when it comes from a GDP point of view, you know, the greater GDP volume total is from the nnEMF guidelines, for example, FCC guidelines.
Right.
But with a recent number of high court orders, those countries have been switching over. So Germany, about 2 years ago, switched that now, okay, their power line distribution system has to change to allow closer proximity of people while implementing technologies advancements to mitigate the propagation of magnetic fields. And sort of, so taking from that, I mean, those two are quite extremes. And, you know, seeing this cultural change in practice, I mean, recently I understand you were in Spain and Poland, and sort of tell us a bit more about your experience there with the activism and the changes coming from a cultural perspective. Because I noticed,
it is interesting because I think that the whole question of the adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields is growing around the world for a variety of reasons. I was at a meeting in Spain, a meeting that I've been a part of since, I think, organizing one of the first ones in the mid-1990s. But this is the meeting on environmental health in Eastern and Central Europe. And it's almost always focused entirely on chemical exposures and chemical issues. But at this meeting in Poland, I was invited to give a keynote lecture on adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields. First time I think that ever happened, and an enormous amount of interest. And then I went on to Spain, and that was different. It was a meeting organized by individuals that suffer from electrohypersensitivity. It was in the absolutely gorgeous city of Segovia that I had never visited before, which has a 2,000-year-old Roman aqueduct, a gorgeous walled inner city with a castle and a beautiful cathedral. But there were some 200 people that formed a line meandering through the city, ending up in the city square, holding signs and trying to explain to all the tourists and the people that were there that there is a real problem with our dependence on exposure to wireless everything, and that certain individuals become ill because of it. It was quite a different experience than the meeting in Poland, but it also resonated because this had individuals telling their own story of how they developed this syndrome of electrohypersensitivity.
Yeah, I mean, what I also find interesting in the thesis relating to those areas that you visited, you mentioned earlier that education doesn't play as much a role as legislation. But what I found is that with education is what we indoctrinated when we are young, say, for example, in religion or even in science, dictates what our belief system will be going further on, and which can make quite a hampering issue, especially even in sciences.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
So even in the case of religion, I found quite an interesting pattern between countries that were predominantly Protestant or communities that were Protestant versus Catholic. And what they found was the Catholic ones had a very different value risk threshold to non-native EMFs and other risk aspects versus Protestants. And what it came down to also was the way the brain saw things or patterns, the training of non-linear connecting the dots. So in the Protestant pattern, it was taking what the book says and believe what the book says of the word of God. Where in the Catholic religions, and this goes to Hindus and Taoism and et cetera, is that the universal God can be explained and must be explained by multiple different mechanisms. So we have different saints, different deities, and different ways of interpreting, understanding the linkages in the universe. So those base groundworks has an impact on how the community would have a different impact or a projection towards the effects of the environment on one's health and the value of health and life. And I found this
very interesting analysis. I had never thought about religion as being a factor of how one approaches these issues, but you make a good argument.
Yeah, I mean, we even found in the spatial modeling as one, when I was taking into account permit applications. So with the sort of Protestant value system on permit applications on churches and that, all of them were approved. But the religions that had the different approach on God and the universe, like the Catholic ones, all the permit applications were rejected flat out. So it's quite interesting to see that correlation pattern. It goes more to social science, and we take it into that. But we see the same thing in sciences, and like you said, with medicine, where doctors are taught it will only be ionizing radiation that can have this effect. And because they're not taught biophysics, it's quite a difficult issue. I mean, one of the guests on the show previously, he mentioned how, me going to biophysics, my job and my role is, because my pursuit to become a lecturer, is to teach first year and second year medicine students biophysics and these different changes. And It is a long process, because as even as you found from studies, it takes 20 to 25 years to go from a desktop study to practical implementation.
That's right.
We sort
sometimes even longer.
Yes, it does. And sort of we kind of seeing that pattern slowly emerging now, even with the findings from the NTP and the Ramazzini study, even though I know there's a lot of different things around it. But the pattern that comes out of it as well, there was a press thing by, I think, Dr. Balogi. I'm not pronouncing correctly, but
right, I know who you're talking about.
Yes, from the Ramazzini study. And the message at the end was that, the information from the studies is critical, and that as a researcher, it's must be disclaimed, based on results, keep cell phones away from children, keep them away from pregnant mothers especially. However, they are only, policy advisors. They produce the science. They're not policy mandators or legislators. And it's up to the public to take action based on the scientific evidence. And, where the public thinks, oh, you're a scientist and you're part of the government, or you're funded by the government, therefore you should be taking the action on our behalf. And there's this difficulty between, creating a relationship between the public and the scientists, just like you experienced as yourself.
Well, you're absolutely right, and this is worth talking about a little bit. I just yesterday submitted the page proofs on a major article on health effects of electromagnetic fields, with colleagues from France, from Sweden, and from Italy and from Slovakia. When you write a manuscript, the reviewers almost always will criticize you if you make policy recommendations. They will say, stick to the science, and you have to add all of the limitations to your study, and no study encompasses every possible aspect of a problem. So I would suspect in the Ramazzini paper that those qualifications were insisted by, they were result of reviewers' comments that said, don't overstep the results of your study. Don't talk about them in that fashion. That was exactly what we got in the reviews of our paper, which was, it summarized the cancer from mobile phone use. It summarized the evidence for hormonal and clinical chemistry changes in individuals with electrohypersensitivity, and then discussed in great detail the mechanisms, where we concluded that oxidative stress and generation of oxygen species was the primary mechanism whereby both cancer and electrohypersensitivity were developed, as well as the effects on male fertility and many of the effects on cognitive function, where the evidence is best probably with children, but there's evidence for cognitive changes in adults as well. So, but then we were criticized because we used that evidence to argue for more stringent regulation, especially by the World Health Organization, but by other national governments. And, the reviewers said, well, stick to the science. Don't talk about the implication of these studies. So whose responsibility is it to take the science and try to push for regulation? Well, in my view, it's my responsibility. It's the responsibility of other people that are at a stage of their career where they're not quite so vulnerable to being intimidated by industry threats to their livelihood, their grants, their position. I think scientists need to step up and push when there is evidence for harm from some exposures that maybe everybody likes too much. They like their mobile phone too much. But we do have a responsibility to push for regulation and push for change and to educate the public, not just the scientific community.
Yeah, it's very challenging in science. I mean, even in my experience, I was fortunate. I mean, with my thesis, my two supervisors, they didn't, or even in South Africa, there isn't the experience or exposure for these type of the study research that I do. So they had to focus on me following the rules and how to find the best way navigating through the protocols and methodologies of science and academia. And, I mean, my one professor was a very big critic of the stuff, saying, oh, you can't say this, or it's just too scary, or what if the university gets sued, and all these other issues. And one of the things I had to then do was find warrants for my applied methodologies to get away with making the bolder statements backed up by facts and proofs. And one of the things which is more practiced in Europe is a thing called the practitioner research methodology, where it's a scientist's job to do practice of the science and deriving results to influence government policy. And by doing that, it was a lot easier to demonstrate what I did. But again, the issue became a multidisciplinary paper. And as you said, with reviewers, to find reviewers that can even do that is exceptionally difficult. One of my reviewers was Professor Michael Kundi, which I was very fortunate because he's an expert in multidisciplinary sciences. But it is very tricky, and it's finding these ways around it, like you said. And it's also difficulty of, I mean, that's why we're doing this show interview, because with the rules of academia, you are restricted to what words or statements you can use. But at public presentations or conferences, you're more freely to disclose and say these things. And there's not going to be this lashback kind of thing, which my supervisor told me.
In some ways, I would maybe take a little issue with you on that. I think it's extraordinarily important for scientists to speak to the public, use the press to convey information. But at least in the US, there's a lot of resistance, especially by junior people, assistant professors, graduate students, associate professors, because there seems to be a sense in the academic community that you should sort of stick to your own and not be an advocate for a particular position. I really think that's counterproductive, if we have scientific results that have implications for the health of the population, we need to talk to the press. We need to do interviews. We need to, have a web page that tries to communicate with the outside community. But there is a certain resistance to that, a sense that if you're too public, you're somehow cheapening your academic credentials.
And it's also difficult because you took two oaths. One, when you became a physician, you took the Hippocratic Oath. And the second was when you became a postgraduate academic, you took the researcher oath, where it is your job to do research that's going to disrupt existing knowledge, no matter what those results are. And you, as you said, it's your responsibility or your oath to publicize and disrupt that existing knowledge. And there's going to be feedback, but it is your oath to do those kind of
Absolutely, absolutely.
Segueing aside, I wanted to also cover, you mentioned also earlier with children and cognitive deficiencies. So, if we'll take the bold statement of calling exposure to non-native EMFs as child abuse, how would you agree or disagree, or how would you say that, and back it up with the physiological aspects in terms of affecting the brain and what we understand with studies?
Well, I do think it's child abuse, and I think this is a very serious issue because even among people, and I'm talking primarily now about some of my students that have young children, it's so convenient to give a child a wireless device where they can play with it and look at pictures and look at cartoons and so forth, and not understand that they're causing exposure to the developing brain. Now, I've done a lot of work over the years with cognitive deficits caused by lead, by methylmercury, by PCBs, by environmental tobacco smoke, by malnutrition, all of which are known to reduce the cognitive function of the brain. And I've done some studies to try to understand the mechanism, at least, of the metals and the PCBs. But the issue there is that most of our evidence indicates that these are permanent, irreversible decrements in cognitive function. Now, the effects of radiofrequency fields on cognitive function in children is not as developed as for some of these chemicals, but the indications are all there that they're doing exactly the same thing. You're having changes in EEG, you have changes in evoked potentials, you have changes in metabolism of the brain. Are they really permanent? Well, there's some evidence from what few studies have been done that children that use their mobile phone excessively do less well in school than children that do not. We need to have a lot more work there. But I would certainly argue that anything that is allowed to be put on young children when they're developing that interferes with the development of cognitive function is the ultimate in harm, because when these impacts are irreversible, then that child is going to live their whole life without having the brain power that they would have had otherwise. Well, there certainly are genetic factors that influence intelligence, but there are enormous number of different environmental agents that do the same thing. And we've got to prevent young children from being exposed to things that are going to reduce their cognitive potential.
Yeah, we see from Doug Wallace's work that since you cover genetics, that 5% falls under genetics and 95% falls under epigenetics, meaning that there's the influence from the environmental factors.
That's right, and a major factor in epigenetics is reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. And of course, then you're changing just the whole genetic background, not just one particular gene.
Yeah, because we understand with the mitochondria basically being a flight controller for the system, and how it affects it sort of creates the flick switches for the genetic markers of, okay, open up this disease, close this disease. Or so when that gets disrupted, we have the opening of these genetic disorders that sort of all of a sudden pick up as an epigenetic factor. And you were just covering now about the personal devices, or personal exposures. And now we also need to take into account the ambient or the infrastructure exposures. These are things that happen 24/7 that are affecting the circadian rhythm and the homeostasis of the body. So one of them that's been quite an issue coming up now is the whole thing around smart meters. So not only is it the wireless high pulses coming all the time, but there's also the issues of voltage transients and that come with it. So even if the smart meter is hardwired, we still have the capacity inside, the measuring capacitor, that creates these issues of voltage transients on the wiring. So then there's the issue that not only do you have to install additional spurious emissions filters or voltage transient filters to try rule that out.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are many things that we don't quite understand yet in terms of the whole EMF and what are the major components that trigger disease. But evidence grows stronger all the time that it's these transients. Now, what smart meters use are very, very high intensity, but very brief pulses. And it's almost certainly these very high intensity pulses, the very fast on and off, that make them so particularly potent in triggering the symptoms of electrohypersensitivity. The mean exposure, if you average it over a long period of time from a smart meter, and of course it does vary with distance, but the mean intensity is not that great. Yet when smart meters are put on homes, there's an enormous increase in the development of symptoms. So I think that we need more research on this whole general subject of which components of electromagnetic fields are most provocative in terms of development of disease. But the transients are clearly very important. Now, there's the other really frightening thing on the horizon in many countries is the development of the fifth generation, the 5G higher frequency mobile communication network, because this involves putting little, basically cell towers, mobile phone base stations, about every 300 meters in every urban street, mounted on light poles, telephone poles, whatever's in the street. And this is going to generate radio frequency radiation at a higher frequency continuously, so you're not going to be able to walk down the sidewalk without being continuously exposed. Now, all of these forms of radio frequency communication have a carrier wave, and then they have transient superimposed on that. So it's a complex thing. It probably applies to both the magnetic field, power line frequency, electricity frequency, and the radio frequency, that you have these components that raise high in very rapidly changed transients, and these seem to be a major factor in the development of symptoms. Whether that's true for cancer or not is unclear, but it certainly seems to be the case with electrohypersensitivity.
Well, we understand with, regarding cancers that when the signaling for apoptosis is disrupted, then the cell just keeps on proliferating. And then, because when I say the non-native EMFs and other factors, or the redox being affected, because the covalent bonds are being disruptive and the respiratory proteins are being stretched, electron train transport is being affected. And it tends to want to accelerate in order to have the cell grow even faster. And I mean, Harod did some nice recent work where he applies a static magnetic field, and that's able to alter the electron trains transport, so the cancer cell is actually being starved in terms of the cusp of energy it normally takes. And then as a result, it creates this way artificial apoptosis, and the cell then dies.
Yeah, I mean, that's beginning to get at the fundamental mechanisms whereby electromagnetic fields can affect the normal physiology and metabolism of cells.
And then on to the thing, we're coming near the end because I know you've got quite a busy day. The issues with pregnancies. I know you've mentioned some of your past papers with exposures to magnetic fields and the issues of pregnancies, and now also with mothers just having more exposure with their wireless devices. Give us sort of your inputs on the studies in a brief review.
Well, clearly the fetus is the most vulnerable stage of all human development. And that's because their body is growing, the nerve cells are migrating, they're forming connections that are going to be the basis of everything that happens for the rest of their life. That's been known to be very vulnerable to chemical exposures for many, many years. And there's increasing evidence now that that even prenatal exposure, if the mother uses the mobile phone excessively during pregnancy, there is a greater risk that the child will develop symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example, that the child will sleep less well. So everything that applies for adults applies for the fetus and for the very young child, but in a greater degree of severity because of the fact that their nervous system is growing and developing.
And with you being, like I said earlier, your father yourself, grandfather, and also your father to your students and their children. So sort of give us what's your advice on how you are being a super dad to create this protective environment. First, you're putting action on yourself to protect to be a leading example, but how do you propagate that knowledge and protection as a parent or father to the remaining children within your sphere?
Well, it's a very difficult question to ask, but I think the short answer is one's always best by leading by example. Now, am I totally successful? No. My daughter came to visit not very long ago. My daughter's a horse reproduction veterinarian. She has a very busy life. And I was horrified to see her put her cell phone in her bra. And I immediately brought her to my office and gave her a copy of a published manuscript that showed that women they're usually active professional women that wear their cell phone in their bra, which sounds to me like it'd be uncomfortable, but apparently it isn't, they have an elevated rate of breast cancer if the phone is active. And my daughter said, boy, yeah, but it's so convenient. And I asked her later, has she stopped doing that? She said, well, I've reduced the amount of time, but I haven't stopped. So, the education is important. Knowledge is important. If you don't know something is dangerous, of course you don't have any basis for not doing it. But simply knowing something is dangerous doesn't necessarily change behavior, especially when the perception is that the risk is not so high and the convenience for doing it or the desire to continue doing it is high. But we've got to start with knowledge. And this is why it is so important to have more research to document specific routes of exposure resulting in specific disease. But at the same time, at the present time, from my perspective, the weight of evidence that there's significant harm from electromagnetic fields is very, very strong. Now, certainly brain cancer is not that common. Schwannomas, as these things that are the basis of acoustic neuromas and the schwannomas of the heart that are seen in the National Toxicology Program study and the Ramazzini study, these are quite rare. But the point is that they demonstrate, even in animals, that excessive exposure to, it's not even excessive, the NTP study was basically exposure akin to that you'd get by using a mobile phone. The Ramazzini study was exposure at the level of living near a mobile phone base station. So these are ambient level exposures and that they increase risk of cancer. But then other diseases are not so rare. Clear evidence for reduction in sperm counts if you are exposed to radiofrequency radiation. And I've often told my class, well, if a man of reproductive age holds a wireless laptop in his lap for about 3 hours, he probably doesn't have to use condoms for the next week. The whole issue of these cognitive effects, does your brain really not work as well if you're exposed to electromagnetic fields? Is that a permanent effect? In adults, probably it's not permanent, but how long does it last? Does your brain not work as well for 48 hours, for 2 weeks, whatever? So these are important issues, and we need more evidence, but at the present time, we have sufficient evidence to recommend caution, both at the level of a personal and individual levels, but also to argue for greater regulatory response. We've got to get rid of these ridiculous standards in so many countries that argue that there's no adverse effect of electromagnetic fields, of radiofrequency fields, except those caused by tissue heating, like what you have in a microwave oven. There's so much evidence for harm at much lower intensities. And yet, government and international agencies, even the World Health Organization, ignores all of this evidence.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's key critical there because, you know, being a father myself, it's always challenging that, you know, like you mentioned with your daughters, you know, if you end up fighting too much, it's sort of you're dealing with an energy vampire. And if you're always trying to sort of, you know, fight with that, you end up hurting yourself as one, draining yourself even more and crippling your health, which means you can't help yourself or others. And it's difficult as a father sort of to decide, okay, where's enough was enough. But you're having this impact as a where more and more youth now, because of the exposures, are coming with these diseases that normally meant to have when they're 60s or 70s, when they're in their 20s and 30s, things like strokes or heart attacks and other issues. And with this pattern prevalence of these, you know, issues of, you know, being admitted to the hospital at a very young age, sort of creates this wake-up call where someone goes, okay, you know, Dad, something's going wrong here. What do I do, or how can you help me? And you know, part of that's why I switched my PhD is to focus on these mitigation options. What is more the practical elements that one can implement when their energy flow has dropped to such a capacity, and they want to sort of get this recovery or improve their current biological performance. And you know, what you're doing, what you're advocating as a super dad is, it's difficult for you to try get directly to your child, especially at her age, of how to influence her. So for our audience members there, the best thing next is to take the research that you've done and other scientists and implement through French politics, which is, you know, protesting and action and taking active campaigns to enforce regulatory issues that are going to impose these fines or control mechanisms so that your daughter would change. So if she, you know, was like smoking, you know, if you smoke in a restaurant, you're going to get a heavy fine. You know, the traffic cop's going to come and or policeman's going to give you a fine. So the same mechanism comes in where, you know, if you have your cell phone or other device given to your child, or, you know, you put it in your brassiere area, you're going to get a fine. Your daughter's going to wake up and go, hold on, I don't, the loss of money is more important.
Just it says that regulation is more effective than education in many cases.
Well, I think that's, you know, enough of my questions today. I know you are very busy, and you've been generous with your time. Is any final comments you have or suggestions that have popped in your head during our discussion?
Well, I think we've covered most of the things that I think are really important. I guess one thing that I've said already, but I feel so strongly about, is that we really have to work to change the regulatory climate. And that's not easy in any situation. This manuscript that we've just submitted really targets the World Health Organization and accuses them of failing to adequately protect the health of the public, particularly the health of children. Now, you know, these are friends of mine, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with them so much as I am trying to move them to look at the evidence that we have, take it seriously, their comment was, well, we depend on the ICNERP, this private organization that has self-appointed members. They're official NGO of the World Health Organization, so that's where we take our advice. Well, that's nonsense. The advice has to come from the level of scientific evidence alone, not from some group that has conflicts of interest and a position that's just not justified. But I think it is critical that all of us that have scientific information convey it both to the public, to government and regulatory bodies.
David, thank you so much for being on our show.
Hey,
and
my pleasure.
We hope to have you again in the future. I know things are always updating and elevating, and as my knowledge grows through my PhD and post-work, I hope to share it more with you and have you back on the show.
Great, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For more, visit www.nicheradio.co.za.